Transnistria and Abkhazia, two breakaway republics which have long been controlled by Russia, are both in serious trouble. Transnistrian society looks like it's heading towards some sort of collapse. This is being caused by a huge energy crisis, which was brought on by Ukraine's decision to turn off the gas pipeline which flows from Russia across its territory on January 1st. In Abkhazia, a pro-Russian president was forced to resign following massive protests about a controversial bill he was trying to push through parliament. A new president will be elected in February, but meanwhile, the country is suffering its own enormous energy crisis, this one partly caused by Russia. And a few weeks ago, an MP in Abkhazia opened fire in parliament on his colleagues, killing one and wounding another. Things are so bad that it's no longer crazy talk to predict that either Abkhazia or Transnistria could collapse this year. Maybe both. That would be pretty shocking. Shocking in its own right, but also shocking because it would show that Russia is beginning to lose control of the periphery of its empire. Historically, empires that start to lose territory like this are heading towards the exit. Is this a sign that the Russian Federation is starting to fall apart? Hi everyone, I'm Fredo Rockwell, and I've long been interested in these two pseudo-states, Transnistria and Abkhazia. I've made videos about both of them, and I visited Transnistria in person. Now they're both in crisis at the same time. The immediate causes are both different, but it could be said that the ultimate causes are exactly the same. These are problems which have been caused by Russia, or at least by bad decisions that Russia has made, and which it may now lack the ability to overcome. Let's review these two situations one by one. First, Transnistria. And I should explain, Transnistria is an exonym. It's a name imposed by outsiders. Locals prefer the name Transnistria and sometimes find the name Transnistria offensive. I don't mean any offense when I use that term, but everyone knows this country or this sort of country as Transnistria around the world, so that's the term I'm going to use. Transnistria's population mostly speaks Russian, and they fought a war of independence against Moldova not long after Moldova became independent from the Soviet Union. But that independence has never been recognized by anyone, not even Russia. It's famous for hanging on to its Soviet-era symbols and terminology, and its leaders have always been staunchly pro-Russian, even going so far as talking about Russia annexing Transnistria somehow in the future, sort of encouraging that to happen. There was a referendum not long ago in which the people of Transnistria voted that they would like to someday join Russia. So it's a very pro-Russia kind of place. Transnistria's existence these last 30 years has caused lots of problems for Moldova, but Moldova has been unable to get rid of Transnistria for three main reasons. The first is that up until now, the Moldovan state has just been weak. The second reason is that Moldova has long been dependent on gas exported by Russia through Ukraine and Transnistria to get to it. And so they couldn't afford to annoy Transnistria too much, or Transnistria could turn off that pipeline and deny Moldova the gas it desperately needed. And the last reason is that Russia maintains a peacekeeping force along the border, 1,500 so-called Russian troops. We'll get to that in a moment. But that's like a tripwire. If Moldova tried to invade Transnistria, those soldiers would get attacked, and that would give Russia a justification for invading or sending in troops and causing havoc. All three of these advantages suddenly turned on their head on New Year's Day when Ukraine turned off the pipeline. There had been an existing deal which had allowed European countries still dependent on Russian gas to get that gas through the pipeline going through Ukraine, despite the fact that Russia had invaded Ukraine. But that deal expired at the end of the year, and as soon as that deal expired, Ukraine turned the pipeline off. Why wouldn't they? The profits from that pipeline go directly to funding the war, which is trying to destroy their country. This created some minor problems for countries in Europe like Slovakia and Hungary, but they did have a long time to prepare. It's caused more problems for Moldova, but it's been absolutely crippling for Transnistria. Not only has it lost most of its leverage over Moldova, but it's in the midst of a huge energy crisis. And I'm really not exaggerating when I say from the media coming out of Transnistria, it looks like the whole place is beginning to fall apart. So I've been trying to read Transnistrian news for like a couple decades. It's been sort of a hobby of mine. Lately, I've been reading an online newspaper, which is sponsored by the Transnistrian government. It's called Transnistrian News. And if you look at the English language version of the website, it's pretty normal. There's some Christmas celebrations. They just had Orthodox Christmas. And, you can tell that there are problems, but they've kind of curated out the worst news. If you switch over to the Russian version and turn on the Google Translate so you can read it easily, my gosh, it looks like the apocalypse has come to Transnistria. Here's a small list of some of the problems that have been reported in recent days. Transnistria consumes 220 megawatts of electricity per day. Without Russian gas, electricity plants can now only produce 150 megawatts per day, and this has led to rolling blackouts across Transnistria, 5 hours of no power for every house or building in the country every day. This is in addition to not having the gas they need to power the central heating system, which is used in Transnistria and many post-Soviet countries. So basically, homes just don't have heat, and it's the middle of winter. It's January. There's a cold snap coming. It could be pretty bad. Schools are on extended holiday until later in the month. Factories are often closed or running at odd hours of the night. The whole Transnistrian economy seems to be on its knees at the moment. And the average citizens in Transnistria are turning to some pretty desperate measures. There's a lot of people cutting firewood, of course. There are people using electrical appliances to heat their homes, things that they wouldn't normally have used. This is causing the system to overload, which is causing power outages for other reasons. And so the electrical workers are having to work around the clock just to keep the system up and running. Some people have died. There was one incident, someone broke into a home and lit a stove and caused a fire when the house burned down. So they're just signs that society is really struggling to grip with its loss of power. And this is during a relatively warm period. Like I say, the cold snap is coming supposedly in a week or two. Also, the central heating system is running at the absolute minimum level to keep it going. They're doing this because if they turn it all the way off, it'll take a month to get it up and running again, and they don't want to do that. But running it at the minimum has caused the heating pipes, which run out through Transnistria, to cool, and that's caused some of them to have breaks. There have been about 800 reported breaks in the pipelines just in the last week. Worst of all, even running at this bare minimum dangerous level for electricity and gas, Transnistria only has enough reserves to keep this going till roughly the end of the month. So February is looking pretty grim. As I mentioned, Moldova is also having problems with energy. They too relied on Russian gas, but they're getting support from Romania and other EU countries. Moldova and other countries actually have offered to send gas and other energy sources to Transnistria to help them through this crisis. But so far, they've refused. And actually what they're doing is they're blaming this whole crisis on Moldova, which is really kind of rich. I won't get into the details because it doesn't make sense and it's based on stuff that's probably not true. But they're refusing help, and they're saying it's not our fault, it's Moldova's fault. But there's a real problem for Transnistria. It's hard to see how they're going to survive without help from Moldova or other nearby countries in the next few weeks, let alone get through to the spring. Transnistria is landlocked. It only borders Ukraine and Moldova. So it's not really easy for Russia to supply it anyhow. There is, in theory, a possibility they could send gas through the Trans-Balkan pipeline, which goes through Turkey and Bulgaria and then Romania, Moldova to Transnistria. But Russia's decided not to attempt this. Why exactly, I'm not sure. Maybe it's a political decision. Maybe they think it will create problems for one of their few remaining pipelines. I don't know. But the upshot is Transnistria is being left high and dry, and their only choice is to look for help from countries which do not support its independence. And if they become dependent on Moldova or other nearby countries for energy, their independence will just basically disappear at that point. But it's really hard to see what other options they have. Now, remember, there are those Russian peacekeepers, which in theory should help Transnistria maintain its independence. But let's talk about a few things. First of all, they're experiencing the same energy problems that the rest of Transnistria does. They also can't be supplied by the Russian army for the same reasons that Transnistria struggles to get supplies from Russia. And the third thing is they're not really Russian. Out of the 1,500, an estimated 100 officers are actually Russian citizens. The rest are local Transnistrians who've signed up to what's effectively the Russian army for an increase in pay and free housing. But they're just locals, and they'll melt away as soon as things get really rough. They don't have very good equipment. They're probably not very well trained. That's not very clear, but they're not there as an offensive force. They're there basically in case anyone attacks to give Russia justification to enter militarily. Now, when Russia invaded Ukraine in the full-scale invasion, it looked like Transnistria was an asset for it. It was a flank of Ukraine that, if they wanted to, they could mount this other invasion from the west. But really, in the last month or so, or last even few days, that's completely turned around. And now Transnistria is exposed. It's in real jeopardy of maybe disappearing, and Russia doesn't seem to have any way to help it out. The good news for most Transnistrian citizens is that because Moldova considers Transnistria part of its territory, they can qualify for Moldovan citizenship. So they can leave Transnistria whenever they want to, and maybe some of them may even have Romanian passports. So staying in Transnistria isn't something people have to do. They can leave and find a safer place. But again, that's an existential threat for Transnistria if everyone up and leaves in February when all the power and gas runs out. Okay, so that's really bad. Let's look at Abkhazia. Things aren't quite as bad in Abkhazia as they are in Transnistria, but they're still pretty bad, and things are still potentially headed for a cliff edge in February. Abkhazia is internationally recognized as part of Georgia. It gained de facto independence after a war of independence in the early 90s from Georgia, much the same way Transnistria did from Moldova at roughly the same time. Also, it's managed to maintain its independence thanks to support from Russia. But one major difference is Abkhazia is the homeland of an ethnic minority, the Abkhaz people. They're not Russians in the same way that Transnistrians consider themselves Russians. So they do have more of a sense of independence. When I've read interviews from Abkhaz officials, when the idea of being annexed or joining Russia has been mentioned, they tend to try and push back from that and say, "Oh, no, we prefer to be independent." I think there is more of a genuine desire for real independence among Abkhazia. That doesn't mean it's legitimate. I'm just saying it has more of a desire to maintain its independence from Russia than Transnistria does. The current crisis kicked off a few months ago when the Abkhaz president at the time signed a deal with Russia, which would allow Russian companies to come in and buy up Abkhaz real estate and other assets very cheaply without paying a lot of taxes, and just basically make it easy for Russian money to come in and swamp Abkhazia and take over a lot of the country through private means. When some Abkhaz MPs tried to stop this bill, they were detained. And this led to protests, which broke out on the 15th of November at the Parliament building and lasted for 4 days, at the end of which Aslan Bajania resigned and a new president will be elected on the 15th of February. Russia was extremely unhappy that its puppet government had been forced out of office, and it retaliated with what were de facto sanctions. Here's what they've been doing. Direct Russian subsidies make up roughly 40% of Abkhazia's state budget. These were immediately stopped. That hurts. Abkhazia is known as a tourist destination. That's a big part of their economy. But Russia's tour operators organization is preventing its members from visiting Abkhazia. So that basically destroys a really important sector in the economy. Then, a few weeks ago, Russian agricultural inspectors suddenly found harmful insects in Abkhaz tangerines and have halted agricultural exports to Russia from Abkhazia. Again, another important industry shut down. And with incredibly bad timing, water levels at the Inguri Dam, which supplies most of Abkhazia's electricity, are extremely low. This has led to 6-hour-long rolling blackouts to save power, and whereas Russia normally sends Abkhazia free electricity to help during this sort of problem, it's refusing to do so now. And that is a gut punch. Russia is taking these extraordinary steps to try and pressure the Abkhaz people into voting in the man they want to be the next president, Badra Gumba. He's the current acting president, and he was vice president before President Bajania was forced out of office. Will the Abkhaz people knuckle under to this enormous economic and political pressure? Maybe, but maybe not. There are currently 5 candidates running for president, including interim President Gumba. Of these, only one is a well-known opposition candidate who might actually stand up for Abkhazia's national interest, Adgur Arjimba, leader of the opposition group known as the Abkhazia People's Movement. The other 3 candidates are regime-sponsored backups, in place in case Gumba falters or withdraws, or they're there to draw votes away from Arjimba. On paper, at least, Arjimba could be a serious threat to Russia's ability to exert power in Abkhazia. He's a former deputy prime minister. He got 35% of the vote in the 2020 presidential elections, and it was his supporters that helped spark off the crisis in November that led to the resignation of President Bajania. Will it be a free and fair election? Unlikely. There are already reports that anonymous Russian money is coming in to try and disrupt the election. So we're not expecting this to be free and fair, but even elections that aren't completely free sometimes produce unexpected results. Also, Abkhazia's parliament recently became a murder scene. Here's the story. During a debate about a bill to ban cryptocurrency mining during the energy crisis, and cryptocurrency mining has been a huge thing in Abkhazia for many years, MP Adgar Kharazia pulled out a pistol and began shooting. Khan Kvartia, an MP who opposed the bill, was wounded in the head and arm and hospitalized, but another MP, Vakhtang Galanzia, was killed. Kharazia fled the scene and is still at large. Kvartia, now out of the hospital, was planning to run for president and is also considered a serious opposition figure, but is now withdrawn from the race. Also, the bill to ban crypto mining during the energy crisis, this is something that interim President Gumba is accused of profiting from, has not been debated, let alone passed, since that incident. So things are pretty unstable in Abkhazia politically, but whatever the outcome in the election that comes up in February, things will probably still be unstable. If Badr Gumba wins and continues to pursue pro-Russian policies that are unpopular, that doesn't solve anything. We could easily be back in a situation in which there are mass protests and forced resignations. If Adgar Ajimba wins, Russia will likely continue its de facto sanctions, and that would just be horrible for the people of Abkhazia. I think we'd have to say that Abkhazia's situation is less dire than the situation in Transnistria, but that's not really saying much. If depending on Russia becomes impossible, Abkhazia could turn to Georgia for support. Georgia is the country that the international community recognizes as the state which actually controls Abkhazia. So if they do that, in the same way that Transnistria would lose its independence turning to Moldova, Abkhazia would likely lose its independence if it became dependent upon Georgia. But there is one other complicating factor in all this. Russia's navy was forced out of Crimea by Ukraine earlier in the war and has since built a naval base in Abkhazia. This, in theory, gives Abkhazia leverage over Russia, but actually it might mean that Russia, who can't afford to lose another Black Sea naval base, will just be that much more desperate to control events in Abkhazia and won't mind at all if the people of Abkhazia suffer. What does all this mean? Well, there's no direct connection between the two crises that are happening in Transnistria and Abkhazia, so maybe the fact that they're happening at the same time is just a coincidence. However, both events have been caused by Russian overreach. Russia invaded Ukraine, and that was obviously stupid as well as wrong, and that's led to the events which have now left Transnistria without a power source and in which its future is in doubt. Russia also tried to intervene heavily in Abkhazia's economy with this bill that would allow oligarchs to pick up land and property and other assets on the cheap. And that's provoked the political crisis and also the energy crisis, which is happening in Abkhazia. And in both events, Russia is on the back foot. Its economic and military resources are tied up fighting the war in Ukraine. It can't afford to dedicate many resources towards sorting out things in Transnistria or Abkhazia. And Russia simply lacks the ability to exert power in these two breakaway republics like it did before February 2022. The Russian Federation is not technically an empire, but it kind of runs itself like it is an empire, and for decades has managed client states and puppet states on its periphery, just like a classic empire. It recently lost Syria. Its control over Transnistria is looking pretty shaky, and depending on how things go in Abkhazia, it could lose control there in the next month or two. Maybe. But when empires start losing control over the states at their periphery like this, historically, that's a sign that they're headed possibly for collapse. Is the Russian Federation headed for a breakup? Just in the same way the Soviet Union broke up not long after it lost control of Poland, East Germany, and Lithuania? Maybe. I don't think it's definite, but I do think this is a moment that if the Russian Federation did break up, that historians would look back and say, yeah, this was a moment when we can say that this latest version of the Russian Empire started to unwind. Thanks for watching. This has been a different video than I typically make because it's focused very much on current events. But if you like it, let me know in the comments and I'll try and do more content like this. Also, I'm working on 6 episodes of a podcast, which I'm hoping will be out in the next month or two. The future of Russia has become a recurring theme in many of the episodes we've recorded so far. And so if you'd like to make sure you don't miss that, go ahead and subscribe and look out, like I say, for the Fredo Rockwell podcast coming your way later in January or maybe in February. And I'll see you guys in the next video.